As we've seen today, the Kremlin's rejection of reports about a new peace initiative was not simply a diplomatic soundbite. It reflected deeper strategic calculations that continue to shape every aspect of the Russia-Ukraine war. On one side, Ukraine and its allies continue searching for ways to reduce the violence and reopen meaningful negotiations. On the other, Russia insists that any serious proposal must address its long-standing security demands before formal talks can move forward. For now, the gap between those positions remains significant. The fighting continues. Military production continues. International diplomacy continues. And millions of people remain affected by decisions made far from the front lines. The coming weeks may reveal whether recent diplomatic contacts develop into something more substantial, or whether they become another chapter in a long series of unsuccessful attempts to end the war. One question now hangs over the international community. Is this merely another pause before the next escalation, or could it become the first step toward a genuine negotiation process? We'd like to hear your perspective. Do you believe diplomacy still has a realistic chance of ending this conflict, or do you think both sides remain too far apart for meaningful progress? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this analysis informative, consider subscribing to the channel for more fact-based coverage of the Russia-Ukraine war, global geopolitics, and the international developments shaping today's world. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.
The Kremlin says it has not seen anything concrete. That was Moscow's response as new discussions over ending the Russia-Ukraine war moved back toward the center of international diplomacy. While Washington and Kyiv prepared for another round of high-level talks, the Kremlin made it clear that Russia was not ready to react to reports about new peace proposals without seeing the details. But the timing is critical. The war is still active across the front lines. Russian attacks continue to hit Ukrainian territory. Ukraine is continuing its own long-range campaign against targets inside Russia. And behind the diplomatic statements, both sides are still trying to improve their position before any serious agreement can take shape. The result is a dangerous contradiction. The world is talking about peace again, but the war is still being fought with the expectation that military pressure could shape the outcome of future negotiations. And that raises a major question. Is the Kremlin waiting for a realistic path toward peace? Or is Moscow using time, military pressure, and uncertainty to strengthen its position before making any meaningful decision? The latest developments came as the United States and Ukraine discussed possible new approaches to restarting peace negotiations. Reuters reported that Ukrainian and American officials had discussed the possibility of a proposal involving an aerial ceasefire. The reported idea would focus on reducing or stopping long-range attacks involving missiles and drones. However, the Kremlin responded cautiously. Russian officials said it was too early to comment because the reports had not been confirmed and Moscow had not received a specific proposal. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Russia would judge any initiative according to whether it matched Russian interests. That statement may sound diplomatic, but it reveals the central problem facing every attempt to end this war. Russia and Ukraine are not simply negotiating over a temporary reduction in attacks. They remain divided over territory, security, military power, political conditions, and the future relationship between Ukraine and the West. For Ukraine, a ceasefire without reliable security guarantees could give Russia time to rebuild its forces and prepare for another offensive. For Russia, accepting a ceasefire without achieving its major objectives could mean ending the war without securing the political and territorial outcome the Kremlin has pursued. And for the United States, the challenge is finding a proposal that can reduce the fighting without appearing to reward continued military pressure. This is why even a limited agreement involving air attacks could become politically important. Long-range drones and missiles are no longer secondary weapons in this war. They have become a central part of the strategy on both sides. On July 24th, Russia said it believed President Donald Trump was sincere in his efforts to end the war and that Moscow would wait for new proposals from Washington. But Russian officials also made clear that any proposal would have to be evaluated according to Russia's interests. That language is important. Russia is not saying that diplomacy is impossible. It is saying that diplomacy must operate within conditions Moscow considers acceptable. Only a few days later, the Kremlin said it had still not seen anything tangible regarding new peace proposals ahead of talks between Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. That response showed that public discussion about peace had moved faster than the actual diplomatic process. There is a major difference between discussing an idea and presenting a formal proposal. A report about a possible ceasefire does not automatically mean that both sides agree on the terms. It does not explain how violations would be monitored. It does not answer whether the agreement would include attacks on military targets, energy infrastructure, or defense industries. And it does not resolve the larger question of what would happen on the ground. Even if Russia and Ukraine agreed to reduce long-range air attacks, fighting could continue across the front lines. Artillery could continue. Ground operations could continue. Drone warfare close to the battlefield could continue. And both countries could continue preparing for future military operations. That means an aerial ceasefire, if one were ever agreed, might reduce some of the most destructive attacks without ending the war itself. But even that limited step could be difficult. Russia has relied heavily on long-range strikes to pressure Ukraine's military infrastructure, energy systems, and cities. Ukraine has increasingly used long-range drones and missiles to strike Russian military facilities, oil infrastructure, ports, and other strategic targets. Both sides believe these attacks affect the wider balance of the war. So asking them to stop would require both countries to give up a tool they consider strategically valuable. The Kremlin's cautious response is also connected to the broader military situation. Russia has repeatedly said that it will continue pursuing its objectives. In a June interview, Putin said Russia would continue its frontline campaign and stated that Moscow's goals included full control of the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions that Russia claims. Ukraine rejects those territorial demands. Kyiv has consistently argued that Russia cannot be allowed to use military force to permanently change internationally recognized borders. This disagreement is not a minor detail. It is the central obstacle to a comprehensive peace agreement. If Russia believes it can improve its position through continued military operations, then the Kremlin may see little reason to accept terms that freeze the conflict before those objectives are achieved. Reuters reported earlier this month that sources close to the Kremlin believe Putin was rejecting pressure to negotiate and could continue escalating the war. The report said Putin viewed full control of the Donbass as essential to what Moscow would consider a successful outcome. That does not mean every decision has already been made. Wars change. Military conditions change. Economic pressure changes. Political leadership changes. But it does suggest that the Kremlin may not view the current moment as the right time to make major concessions. Instead, Moscow may believe that continued pressure can improve its bargaining position. That is one reason the diplomatic language remains so cautious. The Kremlin is leaving the door open to negotiations while avoiding any commitment to a proposal it has not seen. While diplomats discuss possible agreements, the military conflict continues. Russia has maintained large-scale attacks against Ukrainian territory. Earlier this month, Ukraine said Russia launched 74 missiles and 496 drones during a major attack that damaged residential buildings in Kyiv and killed at least 17 people. After that attack, the Kremlin said Russia would continue increasing pressure on Ukraine and maintained that its strikes were directed at military or military-related targets. The scale of those attacks demonstrates why an aerial ceasefire is being discussed. Long-range strikes affect much more than the battlefield. They can disrupt electricity. They can damage infrastructure. They can force civilians into shelters. They can pressure governments by creating uncertainty far from the front line. Ukraine has responded by expanding its own ability to strike inside Russia. Ukrainian attacks have targeted oil facilities, ports, military locations, and other infrastructure. These strikes are designed not only to cause physical damage, but also to force Russia to spend more resources protecting territory far from the battlefield. Russian officials have criticized the idea that deeper Ukrainian attacks could create conditions for peace. The Kremlin has argued that escalation could prolong the conflict rather than end it. But Ukraine and some Western officials see the issue differently. Their argument is that Russia may be more willing to negotiate if the cost of continuing the war becomes higher. This creates a strategic cycle. Ukraine increases pressure to change Russia's calculations. Russia responds with more military pressure. Each side argues that its actions are necessary to create better conditions for peace. But those same actions can also make a political settlement more difficult. So the situation now contains two competing realities. The first is diplomatic. Washington and Kyiv are discussing new ideas. Russia says it is willing to consider proposals, but insists that it must see concrete details. The second reality is military. The fighting continues. Long-range attacks continue. And neither side has shown that it is prepared to abandon its major objectives. That is why the next phase of diplomacy could become so important. The real question is not whether another peace proposal will appear. The real question is whether any proposal can change the calculations of the leaders who still believe that military pressure may improve their position. And that is where the conflict becomes even more complicated. Because behind the front lines and the diplomatic statements, Russia is facing another challenge. The cost of protecting its territory, sustaining military production, and defending critical infrastructure is continuing to grow. One of the biggest questions surrounding this war is why the Kremlin continues to project confidence despite years of fighting, unprecedented Western sanctions, and sustained military resistance from Ukraine. The answer is not found in a single battlefield. It lies in Moscow's broader strategic calculation. For the Kremlin, this conflict has always been more than a contest over territory. Russian leaders have repeatedly framed the war as a long-term struggle against what they describe as NATO expansion and Western influence along Russia's borders. That narrative remains central to the Kremlin's messaging. As long as Russian officials believe their long-term security objectives have not been met, they are unlikely to accept an agreement that simply freezes the conflict without addressing those concerns. At the same time, Moscow appears to believe that time itself can become a strategic weapon. Russian officials have consistently argued that Western political unity could weaken over time, especially as governments face economic pressures, elections, and changing domestic priorities. If support for Ukraine becomes more difficult to sustain politically or financially, the Kremlin may calculate that its negotiating position gradually improves without making major concessions. That does not mean this strategy is guaranteed to succeed. But it helps explain why Russian officials continue speaking about negotiations while simultaneously maintaining military operations. From Moscow's perspective, diplomacy and military pressure are not separate tracks. They are being used together. Modern warfare is no longer decided only by tanks and infantry. Increasingly, the battle extends hundreds or even thousands of kilometers beyond the front. Ukraine has steadily expanded its long-range strike capability. Using domestically produced drones alongside Western-supplied systems where available, Kyiv has demonstrated an ability to reach military airfields, logistics hubs, ammunition depots, and energy facilities deep inside Russian territory. These attacks are designed to achieve several objectives at once. First, they force Russia to disperse valuable air defense systems across a much larger area. Instead of concentrating defenses near the battlefield, Moscow must now protect oil refineries, military factories, command centers, bridges, ports, and major cities. Second, they increase the economic cost of sustaining the war. Damage to industrial facilities or temporary disruptions at energy sites may not decide the conflict overnight, but they require repairs, additional security, and significant financial resources. Third, they send a political message. For much of the early war, many Russians experienced the conflict primarily through television coverage. Long-range Ukrainian strikes have made the reality of the war more visible inside Russia itself. Although daily life continues across much of the country, attacks on infrastructure and military facilities demonstrate that distance alone no longer guarantees security. Russia has responded by expanding electronic warfare capabilities, strengthening air defenses, relocating certain military assets, and increasing domestic production of interceptor systems. According to assessments from the Institute for the Study of War, both Russia and Ukraine continue adapting their strategies as drone warfare evolves into one of the defining features of the conflict. Rather than replacing conventional warfare, drones are now integrated into almost every level of military planning. This technological competition means that neither side can afford to stand still. Every new tactic is quickly answered by another. Protecting a country as geographically vast as Russia presents enormous logistical challenges. Military planners must constantly decide where limited resources should be deployed. Should advanced air defense systems remain near the front lines? Or should they be moved deeper into Russia to protect strategic infrastructure? Every deployment involves trade-offs. If more systems are positioned around industrial facilities, fewer may be available closer to combat zones. If they remain concentrated near the battlefield, critical infrastructure farther away could become more vulnerable. Ukraine understands this dilemma. Its long-range campaign does not require every strike to succeed. Even unsuccessful attacks can force Russia to expend expensive interceptor missiles, increase patrols, and allocate additional manpower. Defense analysts often describe this as imposing costs on the defender. A relatively inexpensive drone can compel the target to respond with much more costly defensive measures. Russia has attempted to reduce this imbalance by expanding domestic drone production, improving electronic jamming systems, and integrating layered air defenses. Even so, maintaining this level of protection across such a large territory requires continuous investment. As the war enters another prolonged phase, both countries face a growing challenge. Not simply producing more weapons, but sustaining production month after month while replacing battlefield losses and protecting critical infrastructure. Against this military backdrop, renewed diplomatic discussions face an unavoidable reality. The core political disagreements have not disappeared. Ukraine continues insisting that its sovereignty and internationally recognized borders must be respected. Russia continues emphasizing security concerns and territorial objectives that Kyiv rejects outright. Those positions leave very little common ground. This is why even limited proposals, such as reducing long-range missile and drone attacks, receive so much international attention. A narrow agreement would not end the war, but it could reduce civilian casualties, lower pressure on critical infrastructure, and potentially create space for broader negotiations later. The challenge is trust. Both governments remain deeply skeptical of each other's intentions. Any temporary ceasefire would require mechanisms for verification, monitoring, and enforcement. Without credible guarantees, each side risks believing that the other could simply use the pause to regroup militarily. That concern has complicated previous diplomatic efforts throughout the conflict, and it continues shaping today's negotiations. For now, the Kremlin's position remains cautious. Russian officials say they are willing to examine concrete proposals when they are formally presented. But until that happens, military operations continue. The battlefield, not the negotiating table, remains the primary arena where both sides seek to improve their position. While missiles, drones, and artillery dominate the headlines, another battle is unfolding behind the scenes. It is a battle of factories, budgets, labor, and endurance. Wars of this scale are not won by military strength alone. They also depend on whether a country can continue producing weapons, repairing equipment, paying soldiers, and maintaining public confidence over many years. For Russia, sustaining the war has required a dramatic expansion of defense production. Factories that once focused on civilian manufacturing have increasingly shifted toward military contracts. Production lines for armored vehicles, artillery ammunition, missiles, drones, and electronic systems have expanded as Moscow seeks to replace battlefield losses and maintain pressure on Ukraine. The Russian government has repeatedly highlighted rising defense output as evidence that the country has adapted to wartime conditions despite Western sanctions. At the same time, economists note that this rapid military expansion comes with trade-offs. Resources directed toward defense are resources that cannot be invested elsewhere. Large government spending on the military can support industrial production and employment in the short term, but it also places growing pressure on public finances, inflation, and labor markets. Russia's central bank has repeatedly warned that labor shortages and inflationary pressure remain important economic risks. With hundreds of thousands of workers either serving in the military or employed by defense industries, many civilian sectors have struggled to find qualified employees. Construction companies, transportation firms, manufacturers, and technology businesses have all reported difficulty recruiting workers. That imbalance has pushed wages higher in some industries while also increasing costs for businesses across the economy. Western sanctions were designed to reduce Russia's ability to finance and sustain a prolonged war. Since 2022, restrictions have targeted banking, technology imports, energy exports, shipping, and access to advanced industrial components. Russia has adapted in several important ways. Trade has shifted toward Asian markets. Domestic production has expanded in some sectors. Alternative financial arrangements have reduced dependence on Western institutions. But adaptation does not mean immunity. Many analysts continue to argue that sanctions have increased production costs, limited access to advanced technology, complicated logistics, and reduced long-term investment. These effects are often gradual rather than immediate. Instead of causing a sudden collapse, they can slowly reduce efficiency and make future growth more difficult. That is why economic endurance has become just as important as battlefield success. For Moscow, maintaining military production while preserving overall economic stability has become a balancing act that may continue for years. Ukraine is confronting its own enormous challenges. The country continues defending its territory while repairing damaged infrastructure, maintaining essential public services, and supporting millions of civilians affected by the war. Large sections of Ukraine's energy network, transportation infrastructure, and industrial facilities have been damaged during repeated waves of missile and drone attacks. Although repairs are often completed remarkably quickly, each new strike creates additional financial and logistical burdens. Ukraine also remains heavily dependent on international assistance. Military aid, financial support, humanitarian assistance, and reconstruction funding from the United States, European countries, and other partners have played a crucial role in allowing Kyiv to continue resisting Russia's invasion. This international support has become one of Ukraine's greatest strategic advantages, but it also creates uncertainty. Every election in partner countries, every budget negotiation, every political debate over military assistance. Each of these developments can influence expectations about future support. For Ukrainian leaders, maintaining international backing is almost as important as success on the battlefield itself. That explains why diplomacy remains active even while military operations continue. The Russia-Ukraine war is no longer viewed simply as a regional conflict. Its consequences extend far beyond Eastern Europe. Energy markets, global food supplies, international shipping, defense spending, military alliances. Nearly every major economy has been affected in some way since the full-scale invasion began. NATO has continued strengthening its eastern defenses. European governments have accelerated investments in military modernization, warfare, electronic warfare, and precision missile technology. Military planners around the world are studying this conflict closely, not because every lesson can be applied elsewhere, but because the war has demonstrated how quickly modern battlefields are changing. Autonomous systems, artificial intelligence, satellite intelligence, electronic warfare, long-range drones. All of these technologies are reshaping military planning in ways that extend well beyond Ukraine. Despite renewed diplomatic discussions, the immediate future remains uncertain. The Kremlin says it is prepared to examine serious proposals once they are formally presented. Ukraine continues insisting that any agreement must protect its sovereignty and security. Western governments continue balancing military support for Kyiv with efforts to prevent wider escalation. None of these objectives are easy to reconcile. History shows that wars often end only when political and military calculations change. Sometimes that change comes through diplomacy. Sometimes it comes through developments on the battlefield. And sometimes it comes through economic pressure that gradually alters what leaders believe is possible. At this moment, it is impossible to say which factor will prove decisive. What is clear is that neither side appears ready to abandon its core objectives. That means every diplomatic initiative will face the same difficult question. Can negotiations succeed while both sides still believe that continued military pressure may improve their position? For now, the Kremlin's latest message is one of caution. Russia says it has not yet received a concrete peace proposal worth evaluating. Until that changes, military operations continue. Missiles continue to fly. Drones continue to cross borders. And every new strike makes the search for peace even more complicated. The coming weeks could prove critical. If new proposals emerge, they may become the first serious diplomatic opening in months. If they fail, the conflict could enter another prolonged phase in which military pressure once again takes priority over negotiation. The question is no longer whether peace is desirable. Almost everyone agrees that it is. The real question is whether today's political leaders believe they can achieve a better outcome through compromise or through continued fighting. That decision will shape not only the future of Russia and Ukraine, but also the security landscape of Europe for years to come. What do you think? Can diplomacy still break the current deadlock, or has the war reached a point where both sides believe that only battlefield developments can change the outcome? Share your perspective in the comments below. If you enjoy in-depth, fact-based analysis of the Russia-Ukraine war, global security, and international geopolitics, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest coverage. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next analysis.